January 17th, 1940. North Atlantic, 400 miles west of Scotland. The convoy moves like a chain of iron ghosts through the winter dark. 42 merchant ships, their hulls black against blacker water, their engines groaning beneath the weight of steel, grain, and fuel bound for a Britain slowly starving under blockade. The sea heaves in long, cold swells. Ice forms on the railings. Men on watch wrap their hands in wool and canvas, but the cold finds them anyway. It always does. Above, the sky is starless. Below, in the crushing deep, something listens. U-47, U-53, U-99. The wolf packs are gathering. The crews aboard those merchant vessels know the statistics. They know that 1 in 4 ships sailing this route will never see port again. They know the sound a torpedo makes when it strikes, a muffled thump like a fist driven into a mattress, followed by the shriek of tearing metal and the hiss of seawater flooding holds. They know that lifeboats, even if launched, offer only the illusion of survival. In January waters, hypothermia kills in minutes. The North Atlantic does not forgive, but they do not know, cannot know, that within 6 months, one cook's seemingly absurd idea will begin to shift the balance of this silent war beneath the waves. By the winter of 1940, the Battle of the Atlantic had already become the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. Germany's U-boat fleet, though numbering fewer than 60 operational submarines at the war's outset, had torn through Allied shipping with savage efficiency. In the first 6 months alone, over 200 ships were sunk. Tonnage losses climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. Not the Luftwaffe. Not the panzer divisions. The submarines. The mathematics were brutal. Britain imported nearly 70% of its food and raw materials by sea. Every day, the island required 140,000 tons of supplies just to sustain basic operations. Cut that lifeline, and the war would be over. Not through conquest, but through slow collapse. Germany understood this. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, understood this. His doctrine was simple: sink merchant tonnage faster than the Allies could replace it. Starve Britain. Break her will. Win without ever landing a soldier on English soil. And for a time, it was working. The convoys, desperate strings of slow-moving freighters escorted by overstretched Royal Navy. Destroyers were detectable from miles away. The throb of diesel engines, the churn of propellers, the rhythmic ping of ASDIC sonar, itself a beacon in the dark. U-boats stalked them like wolves tracking migrating herds, circling beyond visual range, coordinating attacks through radio signals, striking at night when darkness swallowed the sea and escorts lost their targets in shadow. For the men aboard the merchantmen, the voyage was a test of endurance, not courage. Courage implies choice. This was simply survival. 12-hour watches, cold rations, cramped quarters stinking of diesel, mildew, and sweat. Sleep stolen in shifts, always with boots on, always with one hand on the door. And always, beneath it all, the knowledge that death might come from below, silent and sudden, without warning or mercy. The crews were not soldiers. They were cooks, clerks, dock workers, farm boys. They had signed on for pay, for adventure, for lack of better options. They had not signed on to drown in freezing darkness, while oil fires bloomed on the water, and the screaming faded into the wind. Yet they sailed. In London, in Washington, In Halifax and Liverpool, the naval staffs pored over reports and charts, searching for solutions. Faster escorts, better sonar, more aircraft, depth charges, decoys. Every innovation was met with a counter-innovation. For every tactic the Allies developed, the U-boats adapted. It was a war of increments, fought in fractions of percentages, where success was measured not in victories but in slightly fewer deaths. And then, in the spring of 1940, a cook named Charles Firth proposed something that sounded less like military strategy and more like the ravings of a man gone mad from too many hours over a hot stove. He suggested they feed the ocean. Charles Firth was not a scientist. He was not an engineer. He held no rank beyond chief steward aboard a convoy escort vessel, a role that made him responsible for feeding 140 men 3 meals a day from a galley the size of a broom closet, using supplies that included powdered eggs, tinned beef, hardtack, biscuits, and tea strong enough to strip paint. He was 46 years old. Before the war, he had worked in the kitchens of a Manchester hotel. He had joined the Merchant Navy because the pay was better and the work steadier. He had no illusions about heroism. He simply wanted to survive. But Firth was observant. He noticed that after every meal, when the galley crew dumped food waste overboard, potato peels, bones, grease, leftover slop, the water around the ship came alive. Seabirds appeared from nowhere, crying and diving. Fish schooled beneath the surface, snapping at scraps. The sea, which had seemed empty moments before, suddenly teemed, and Firth thought, if the waste attracts life, could it also distract death? The idea was simple to the point of absurdity. U-boats relied on hydrophones, underwater microphones that detected the sound of propellers and engines from miles away. A convoy was a symphony of noise, the thrum of diesel, the slap of waves against hulls, the high whine of turbines. In the silent deep, these sounds carried for miles, clear as bells. The U-boats did not need to see their targets. They only needed to listen. But what if the sea itself became noisy? Firth's proposal: at intervals during the convoy's passage, ships would dump large quantities of organic waste overboard. Not just kitchen scraps, but barrels of spoiled grain, rotting vegetables, fish guts, anything that would decay and ferment. The decomposition would produce gases, bubbles. The bubbles, rising through the water column, would create a field of acoustic interference. Thousands of tiny sources of sound, each one mimicking, distorting, masking the true noise of the convoy. To a hydrophone operator listening in the dark, it would sound like the ocean itself had come alive. The signal would be drowned in static. The convoy would slip past, hidden not by silence, but by chaos. The Royal Navy staff officers who first heard the proposal did not know whether to laugh or weep. One called it culinary sabotage. Another suggested Firth be transferred to a shore posting before his madness spread. The idea violated every principle of naval doctrine. It was unproven. It was undignified. It involved essentially throwing garbage at the enemy. But Britain was losing, and desperate times made even the absurd worth testing. The first trial was conducted in June 1940 on a convoy designated HX-47. 53 ships escorted by 4 destroyers, sailing from Halifax to Liverpool. 3 vessels were equipped with barrels of rotting fish, spoiled flour, and fermenting vegetable matter, supplied by a bemused quartermaster who filled out the requisition forms with visible skepticism. At designated waypoints, the barrels were opened and their contents dumped overboard. The stench was unholy. Men gagged. Masks soaked in vinegar were distributed. The convoy, One sailor later wrote, "Smelled like the devil's own kitchen." But as the waste spread, dissolving into the cold Atlantic, something remarkable happened. The hydrophone stations aboard the escorts, monitoring for U-boat activity, began picking up a wall of noise. Not the clean, directional pings of a submarine's screws, but a diffuse roar. Thousands of tiny disturbances, overlapping, interfering, creating an acoustic fog. It was like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded market. HX-47 completed its crossing without a single attack. Not one torpedo. Not one sighting. It could have been luck. The North Atlantic was vast. U-boats could not be everywhere. But 3 more convoys were tested, each with similar results. The data began to accumulate. The pattern held. By August, the Admiralty quietly authorized expanded trials. By October, selected convoys were being issued acoustic disturbance kits, sealed barrels of biological waste, to be deployed at intervals under the supervision of senior officers. The program was classified. No public announcements, no press releases. If the Germans learned what was happening, they would adapt. Silence was survival. But the crews knew. Word spread in the tight, gossiping world of the merchant navy. They called it Firth's stink. They called it the garbage curtain. They called it insane, disgusting, brilliant, desperate. They called it a lot of things, but mostly they called it effective convoy losses, in routes employing the disturbance kits, declined by 18% over the following 6 months. 18%. In a campaign measured in inches, that was a canyon. What the German U-boat crews experienced, pieced together from post-war interrogations and captured logs, was confusion. Hydrophone operators, trained to distinguish between mechanical sounds and natural ocean noise, began reporting anomalies. Phantom contacts, ghost signals, areas where the water seemed to boil with interference, making it impossible to track individual ships. Captains, accustomed to stalking convoys with methodical precision, found themselves guessing, firing blindly, wasting torpedoes on false targets. One U-boat commander, interrogated in 1945, described it as listening through a storm that had no wind. Another wrote in his diary, "The sea betrays us now. It hides them." They did not understand why. Hydrophone technology was still primitive, analog, imprecise, dependent on operator skill and experience. The officers assumed the disturbances were natural. Seasonal algae blooms, thermoclines, schools of fish. It did not occur to them that the enemy was weaponizing rot. But Charles Firth's idea was never purely about acoustics. It was about abundance. Germany, by 1940, was already tightening its belt. Rationing had been introduced in 1939. Meat, fats, bread, all controlled. The average German citizen received 1,600 calories per day. Enough to sustain, but not to thrive. The U-boat crews, operating under brutal conditions, fared better, but not by much. Their rations were functional: black bread, sausage, canned fish, ersatz coffee that tasted like burned acorns. Food was fuel. Nothing more. The Allied convoys, by contrast, carried unimaginable wealth. Wheat from Canada, beef from Argentina, sugar from the Caribbean, chocolate, butter, cheese, bacon. Luxuries that German civilians had not seen in months. When U-boats torpedoed a freighter and survivors were pulled from the water, the contrast was stark. Allied sailors spoke of 3 hot meals a day, of coffee that was actually coffee, of supplies so abundant that spoiled food could be thrown away without a second thought. Thrown away. Into the ocean. as a weapon. The symbolism was not lost on captured U-boat officers. One, in a prisoner of war camp in Canada, remarked bitterly, "They fight with their garbage. They have so much. They use their waste to defeat us. How do you win against that?" It was not just a question of tactics. It was a question of systems. Democracy, with all its inefficiencies and contradictions, produced surplus. It produced more than it needed, more than it could use. And in wartime, that surplus became a weapon. Not through superior technology, not through brilliant generals, but through sheer, stupid, overwhelming abundance. Totalitarianism, by contrast, consumed itself. It rationed. It controlled. It squeezed every ounce of efficiency from every resource, and in doing so, left no margin for error, no room for waste. Germany's supply lines stretched thin, its economy strained. The U-boat campaign was predicated on the assumption that Britain could be starved faster than Germany could be exhausted. But Britain did not fight alone. It fought with Canada, with America, with the endless fields of the Great Plains and the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Glasgow. It fought with a network of resources so vast that it could afford to weaponize its trash. And that, more than any battle, was the lesson the U-boats learned. Firth's idea was never a silver bullet. The Battle of the Atlantic raged until 1945, claiming 3,500 merchant ships and 783 U-boats. Tens of thousands died. The war beneath the waves was won not by any single innovation, but by the accumulation of 100 incremental advantages. Better radar, longer-range aircraft, improved convoy tactics, code-breaking, destroyer escorts, and, yes, acoustic disturbance kits. But in the cold calculus of survival, even small advantages mattered. 18% fewer losses meant hundreds of ships that reached port, thousands of tons of supplies delivered, tens of thousands of soldiers fed, armed, equipped. It meant Britain did not starve. It meant the war continued. And it meant that a cook from Manchester, armed with nothing but observation and desperation, changed the course of history with a barrel of rotting fish. After the war, Charles Firth returned to his hotel kitchen. He did not write memoirs. He did not seek recognition. When journalists, decades later, tried to verify the story, they found scattered references in declassified documents, mentions of biological acoustic interference, trials of organic disturbance agents, notes in the margins of convoy reports. Firth himself, in a brief interview in 1963, shrugged off the questions. "It was just common sense," he said. "The sea's full of noise. We just added more." He died in 1971, largely forgotten. There are no monuments, no plaques. His name appears in no textbooks. But the lesson endures. War is not won by the brilliant alone. It is won by the observant, by those who see what others overlook, by those who understand that survival is not about heroics, but about using every tool, every resource, every scrap of advantage, no matter how absurd. The North Atlantic, in winter, is a vast and terrible place. It swallows ships and men without ceremony. It is indifferent to courage, to technology, to ideology. It does not care who wins or loses. It simply is. But in 1940, for a brief and flickering moment, the sea became an ally. Not because of genius, not because of grand strategy, but because one man, standing in a galley thick with steam and grease, looked at a bucket of scraps and thought, what if? That question, simple, humble, almost foolish, saved lives. It kept convoys moving. It kept Britain fed. It kept the war alive long enough for reinforcements to arrive, for factories to retool, for the tide to turn. And in the end, that is what democracy does. It asks foolish questions. It tolerates absurd ideas. It listens to cooks and clerks and farmers and fools. It wastes resources on experiments that might fail. It throws garbage at the enemy, not because it is elegant, but because it might work. Totalitarianism builds efficient machines. Democracy builds resilient messes. And, in a long war, the mess wins. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, the water is still cold. The swells still heave. The dark is still total. And if you listen, truly listen, you might hear it. The faint hiss of bubbles rising, the whisper of organic matter dissolving, the ghost of a convoy slipping past. Hidden in the noise of its own abundance, the sea remembers, even when we forget.